Welcome back, everybody. It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. This one I'll be doing a similar thing to what I did for the last video. I'll be going over players at each position that I'm expecting to start slow this season. So the last video, I went over players that I expect to come out of the gates hot and really put up some week-winning performances for you guys to start the season. This video, we'll be focusing on the opposite here. I'll be looking at some players that I don't think are set up to succeed necessarily early on in the season, and these are guys that I'm not necessarily saying that you shouldn't be drafting, but guys that I would keep in mind in terms of guys that you could be looking to trade for after their slow starts, guys that if you're drafting, just be prepared for potentially a bit of a slower start. That way you don't get down and just sort of like panic trade them because they're starting slow. These are guys that you should just expect better weeks to come later on in the season than early. So yeah, hopefully you guys are enjoying this. If there's any players you feel like I left off, any disagreements or anything like that, feel free to let me know in the comments. It's always a lot of fun to sort of just interact with you guys there. And yeah, let's just get into it here. Hopefully you guys are enjoying these. So start things off with Dak Prescott here. He's just got a really brutal opening schedule. He leads off the season with a matchup in Cleveland, and they play New Orleans, Baltimore, and the Giants. The Giants and New Orleans aren't necessarily good teams, but they're teams that they should beat relatively handily, and they might not need to air the ball out. And then Baltimore and Cleveland are elite defenses. So a great setup there. On top of that, CeeDee Lamb has yet to report to training camp, so even if he does come back and play, which I'm still assuming is going to happen, I'm assuming that CeeDee will suit up for week one. It's fair to assume there's going to be some rust to shake off there, having to do that against a really dominant Cleveland defense. That's not exactly the easiest thing to do in the world, and it kind of makes Dak like the bottom in terms of the tier of quarterback that I'm still happy leaving my draft with. I've sort of been saying all offseason long that there are 10 quarterbacks I'm happy to get. That last tier being the Burrow, Dak, Love, Kyler tier, like those four quarterbacks. And I think it makes Dak the last quarterback in that tier for me just because I'm expecting a slow start. We don't really know. We're still banking on like Jake Ferguson stepping up and actually being a reliable number two for this team. So there's some question marks around Dak, and when you pair that with this really brutal opening schedule, it makes me a little bit wary of Dak. However, I do think things will improve for him after that first month. Lamar Jackson also makes this list. You probably noticed in this video that the Ravens are going to have a huge theme here. It's just crazy how brutal the opening schedule is going to be for this offense. They start the season with matchups against Kansas City, the Raiders, Dallas, and Buffalo. Kansas City, Dallas, and Buffalo were all fantastic defenses against the pass last season. And if you remember, for the Raiders, they were actually a lot better on defense over the back half of last season. So even though they look like a decent matchup on paper compared to what they put up last season, they were actually a much different unit after they made the head coaching change. This is a team in Vegas that I expect to have a good defense again, and it doesn't get me excited about what Lamar has to offer. And even last year, they were still a bottom 10 matchup for opposing quarterbacks. Lamar's still plenty good here. He's going to overcome it, probably still be a QB1 for those weeks, but I just don't think you're going to see any of those like week-winning performances. Maybe he finds himself in one shootout over the course of those 4 weeks. It certainly could in between those games with Kansas City, Dallas, and Buffalo, but it's just a tough defensive setup there. Weeks 5 through 7 look a lot better for him. He plays Cincinnati, Washington, and Tampa Bay, so just want to highlight that if you want to consider making a trade for Lamar, maybe doing it after like week 3 makes a lot of sense because the schedule should soften up after then. And the last quarterback on this list is going to be Brock Purdy. Part of this just due to the holdout situation and the injury situation the Niners have been dealing with. You've got Brandon Ayuk and Trent Williams both not practicing all offseason while they look for new contracts. Christian McCaffrey, he's been dealing with a calf injury. He hasn't been practicing. So there's just not a whole lot of continuity on this 49ers roster right now. On top of that, you've got a week 1 matchup with one of, if not the best defenses in the NFL in the New York Jets. And even after that, you play Minnesota, the Rams, and New England. Those are not necessarily the best matchups in the world. Minnesota and the Rams are fine, but New England's not a great matchup. I think you could draft Purdy. He's totally fine, but there's no way I'm going to draft him and then feel confident starting him in week 1. So it makes him a kind of guy that you're drafting knowing that you need a second quarterback, and that's probably what you're doing if you're drafting Purdy anyway. But drafting him as your only quarterback just feels like a non-option for me because it feels like you're setting yourself up for a lot of failure in week 1 if you do that. Moving on to running back, the first running back on this list is going to be Saquon Barkley. For starters, he's on a new team. They've got a new offensive coordinator. It's very common in the NFL for these transitions to take some time. It's very common to see it take a couple of weeks to roll this thing out, get things sort of ironed out, and really get up to full speed. So just having that built into Saquon makes it pretty reasonable for him to start a little slow. On top of that, the first 5 weeks are not great at all. He gets a week 1 matchup against Green Bay, which is by no means scary, but then he has matchups against Atlanta, New Orleans, and Tampa Bay, all of which were bottom 8 matchups for opposing running backs last season. And then he's got an early bye in week 5. So as far as the first 5 weeks of the season go, he's set up for the least success of any fantasy running back in terms of what his schedule is. That's not something that we want to get excited about. He's the kind of guy that I think a lot of people might get frustrated with because he had a bit of a down couple years in New York. On a new team, people are expecting elevated numbers, and it could easily happen this year where he comes out of the gate slow, ends up not producing at a high level, and I could really see Saquon being a really valuable trade target around that month point into the season. Trade for him on his bye when people are frustrated and just really reap the benefits later because that schedule does soften up, and I still think he's going to be great. But he's still a top 10 running back for me, but I think because I do sort of expect this slow start, I might prefer to try to trade for him later on in the season and prefer to draft him. So if he slips to me, I'm totally fine taking him, even with this slow start, but he's not someone that I'm like going out of my way to draft above ADP or anything right now. Next up, we've got James Conner, and this is pretty much all matchup dependent here. The first 3 weeks for the Arizona Cardinals are likely losses against really great run defenses. And then on top of that, you've got another matchup against San Francisco in week 5. So 4 of these first 5 weeks are really brutal. You play Buffalo, the Rams, and Detroit. All 3 of those teams are just really good run defenses, and maybe not necessarily the Rams with the departure of Aaron Donald, but they are a team that is very susceptible at getting beat through the air, so they're a team that they're going to be able to throw the ball on. And I just don't know how confident you're going to be in what James Conner can offer early on in the season. These are going to be losing games for the Arizona Cardinals. We know that historically running backs perform a lot better in games where their team win. On top of that, we do see that Trey Benson's coming on a little bit. We could see him get more involved. So I think James Conner is effectively going to be like a low-end running back due for the first month of the season. That is sort of what you're drafting him to be, but I think you're going to need a touchdown for him to pay off. I doubt he's going to put up a ton of yardage, and these are going to be games where I think the Cardinals are going to struggle to run the ball, and him getting that touchdown might just be difficult. Other thing I'll highlight, though, is that from week 6 to 16, James Conner has the easiest schedule in the entire NFL for the running back position. Another guy that I think could be a really nice target to go after in week 5. Of course, James Conner and his health is always something we got to consider, but he is a guy that if he can stay healthy, I think with that back half of the season, he could certainly end up being a league winner. So I'm still okay drafting him where he's going. Just expect him to start a little bit slow and then kick it up in high gear in the second half of the year. And the last running back on this list, and not one that I want to spend a whole lot of time on because he's obviously still fantastic, but Breece Hall starts the season with 2 really brutal matchups. He plays against San Francisco and Tennessee. Both of those teams were bottom 5 matchups for opposing running backs last season. They're also teams that you can throw the ball on pretty effectively, so you don't need to try and lean on your run game. On top of that, the Jets are probably going to lose that game against San Francisco, and then they should beat Tennessee, but it's not like I expect that game to be a blowout either. So I wouldn't expect this to be a situation where Breece Hall in the offense could just really lean on the other team and run the ball a ton. On top of that, Rodgers, coming off of the Achilles injury, probably going to be a little bit rusty. It's just because he hasn't played football or real football in quite some time. I think that's going to limit what the offensive upside of this entire team is just to open the season. And even with all that said, Breece Hall is still a top 3 back for me if you want to have him as high as your RB2, even in your RB1 with the Christian McCaffrey injury. It doesn't scare me at all. I'm more than happy to draft Breece Hall. It's just a matter of I wouldn't expect him to be the reason you win your games in week 1 or week 2, but beyond that, he could easily be the RB1 every single week from that point forward. So, not scared of Breece Hall, just pointing out that he does have a brutal first 2 weeks just to open up the season here. Next up, moving on to the wide receiver position here, we've got Zay Flowers, and it's again another Raven here, and again, it just comes back to the schedule the Ravens set to deal with to start the season. Like I mentioned previously, they played the Chiefs, Raiders, Cowboys, and Bills. That is as difficult as it gets. It's the worst schedule for wide receivers to open the first month of the season, and on top of that with Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews is healthy right now. The majority of Zay Flowers' high-end production last season came when Mark Andrews was injured. Obviously, Zay Flowers is an ascending player in theory. He was a rookie last year. He could certainly take that step forward and maybe even end up being the number 1 target in this offense, but that's not exactly what I'm projecting. I'm still projecting Mark Andrews to be what this offense runs through as long as he's healthy, and if that's the case here, I think that Zay Flowers is going to be the number 2 target on an offense that I wouldn't expect to get the ball rolling very effectively to start the season. And I think you're going to be really disappointed with the price tag you got to pay on Zay Flowers, especially to start the year. So even if he does pay off over the course of the entire season, I think for that first month, Zay Flowers is probably going to be nothing more than like a PPR flex play because they're going to manufacture some touches for him, but I don't think he's going to be a guy that I'm super confident in. I doubt you get a spike week out of him, and I think you're going to be pretty underwhelmed with Zay Flowers for the first month of the year here. Next up, we've got Devonte Adams, and this is again another schedule situation. We've got a week 1 matchup against the Chargers, which is good on paper, but we do expect the Chargers to be improved on defense with all the additions they've made, the coaching changes they've made. It's reasonable to assume that this Chargers pass defense could just be a little bit revamped this season, but after that, you get matches against Baltimore, Carolina, and Cleveland. All 3 of those matchups were bottom 8 matchups for opposing wide receivers last season. They've also got a new quarterback under center in Gardner Minshew to start the season. This is very clearly not the one Devonte Adams wants. He's been very vocal about Aiden O'Connell being his preferred starter, and not that it necessarily matters. I think Gardner Minshew is probably the better option personally, but it's just not an offense that I expect to put up a lot of points in general, and these are bad matchups. And on top of that, I think these are going to be games that are moderately winnable. The Chargers are a team the Raiders should be able to compete with. The Ravens, that's a game they'll lose. But then Carolina and Cleveland, those should be close games as well. And I think their defense is going to be good enough to keep them in these games. And it's actually bad if you're a Devonte Adams manager, because if you want to see him put up big numbers, you need this to be a situation where the Raiders get down early and they have to really just try and play catch up. And if this defense is good, if their opponents aren't good enough to blow them out, you're going to continue to see a run-first approach, a slow pace of play, and it's going to really limit what Devonte Adams can do. So I'm pretty out on Devonte Adams in general, but this brutal start to the season certainly turns me off of him even more this year. And the last wide receiver on this list, this one hurts me a little bit, but we've got to point out Chris Olave. 4 of his first 5 matchups are against bottom 5 opponents in terms of fantasy points allowed last season. So that is obviously not good for Chris Olave. 4 of his first 5 matchups are just really tough in terms of what we can expect him to produce. He gets matchups against Carolina, Dallas, Philadelphia. That's the one good matchup for him. Then Atlanta and Kansas City. Just nothing to be super excited about there. They're going to lose 3 of their first 4 games, probably for 4 of their first 5. I wouldn't be shocked at all to see Carolina be there for only win in that first 5 stretch. And I think that the only one they're going to win, that Carolina game, is going to require them to put up a lot of points. So I wouldn't expect this to be a situation where the Saints come out clicking. They're not going to win very many of these games. Dallas, Philly, Atlanta, Kansas City, they're all better teams. 3 of those teams have really good defenses, and there's reasons to be optimistic about maybe Philadelphia having better off defense this season. So I do love Olave. I think he's a really talented player. He could potentially volume his way to being really good despite all of that, but I think I might just try to trade for him around week 5 after he's put up a disappointing start to the season, after a disappointing season in general last year. I think it could be a really rough season here for New Orleans with all that, and I think that in general, Chris Olave is not going to pay off for us to start the season, and having to spend a second-round draft pick on him for a guy who's probably going to be like a mid-tier wide receiver 2 for the first month of the year doesn't really get me all that excited, so I might look elsewhere where he's being drafted and honestly just look to trade for Olave after the draft. Next, we've got the tight end position here. Just 2 we're going to highlight actually on this one. We'll start things off with Jake Ferguson. He opens the season up against Cleveland, the second best defense against the tight end position in 2023. And on top of that, I am in general expecting this Cowboys offense just to start a little bit slow. They've had a lot of guys not practicing, CeeDee Lamb in particular. And CeeDee Lamb is going to be a big part of what makes this offense click. And on top of that, Jake Ferguson, I think, is going to be really dependent on touchdown upside. You're going to need Jake Ferguson to score touchdowns on a weekly basis for you to be consistently excited about putting him into your lineup. And that matchup against Cleveland certainly doesn't get me excited. I don't expect Dallas to put up a huge number against one of those really good defenses. And then weeks 2 through 4, they play New Orleans, Baltimore, the Giants. None of those are fantastic matchups for the tight end either. So I still think Jake Ferguson is better than completely punting on the position. I don't think he's going to be a waste of a pick for you, but picking him, you're kind of drafting him to be your one tight end. You don't really want to have to consider streaming the position if you do that. And I think if I took him, I would be open to the possibility of streaming the position for week 1 because of that really tough week 1 matchup. And I think that that's kind of a tough situation to put yourself in because you're drafting a guy that you want to start all year, but you're also not really confident in what he's going to offer you right out of the gates in week 1. So just a bit of a sticky situation there for Jake Ferguson. I think I'd personally still just probably draft him, start him week 1 just because I don't think it's worth the extra roster spot to take a second tight end if you're taking Ferguson there. But I think it's totally understandable if you want to double dip on tight end if you take Ferguson just so you have some other options early on in the year. And the last player on this list, we'll keep this one quick, but it's Mark Andrews. Again, I just have to highlight that this Ravens opening schedule is going to be really brutal for what their offense is going to be able to offer. Andrews, he's still a fantastic option. He's going to be one of the top 5 tight ends in fantasy as long as he's healthy, and there's no way you're considering benching him, but I think you just might be a little bit underwhelmed to open the season, and if you want to use that as a tiebreaker to consider the guys being drafted around him, the Dalton Kincaids, the Trey McBrides of the world, if you want to take those guys ahead of him because their opening schedules are better, I think that makes a decent amount of sense. So no problem drafting Mark Andrews. I'm still relatively exposed to him as well, but I think that there is a fair path here for him just having a rough start to the year and you being a little bit frustrated with what you've gotten out of the first month of him. So that'll do it for the players that I expect to start the season slow this year. If there are any other players you expect to start slow or any other players you want opinions on, just feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm happy to respond to you guys and get you guys comments there. Really fun interacting with you guys, of course. The next video, I'll be going over some tips and tricks for your drafts here. Just general tips that you guys should employ during draft day, just to make sure that you guys are really locked and loaded. Make sure you come out of the draft with the team that you've been preparing the whole offseason to get. You don't want to get flustered or make some rookie mistakes in your drafts that you really are better than. You don't want to find yourself in a spot where you're drafting a team worse than you really have prepared to draft. So hopefully you guys find that video useful. There will also continue to be 4+ videos the entire course of the rest of the season, every single week. So just make sure you guys subscribe to the channel. That way you don't miss any of that. It's going to be all free all year long. That way I can help you guys win your leagues this year. And then of course as well, if you did make it this far in the video, please do give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. helps with all that. And then one final announcement, at least at the time of me recording this, we've got one spot left in the subscriber league. Please let me know in the comments below if you're interested in joining. You can add your email address there. That way I can email you the invite link. I want to get that league filled as soon as possible, and then we can get the draft schedule and get that rolling. That's going to be a lot of fun for the channel. I'll live stream that draft. I'll provide updates throughout the course of the season as well, and it should just be a lot of fun for us to interact and sort of build a community there. So yeah, appreciate you guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you with the next one. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.